purpose of today's show is to gain a better understanding of a very controversial subject, and that is cold fusion. Some believe this topic is dead. However, my guest, Dr. Eugene Mallove, will not let it die. He believes passionately in the viability of cold fusion. In the simplest terms, cold fusion uses water to produce energy at room temperature. Some things we're going to look at today are why cold fusion has not been embraced by the scientific community, the politics involved, and what the implications would be if cold fusion were proven scientifically. Let me first tell you about Eugene Mallove. He holds a science doctorate in environmental health sciences from Harvard and advanced degrees in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from MIT. Dr. Mallove is the author of several books and has been a science writer for many magazines and newspapers. His 1991 book, Fire from Ice, Searching for the Truth Behind the Cold Fusion Furor, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Currently, he's editor-in-chief of Infinite Energy magazine. He served as technical advisor to the 1997 movie, The Saint. Welcome to the show, and thank you for coming.
I'm delighted to be on.
If you would briefly tell us about the 1989 experiment by the scientists at the University of Utah, to just kind of give us a background as to how this whole thing started.
Yes, there was an amazing announcement at the University of Utah in 1989 on March 23rd, just before the Exxon Valdez ran aground, ironically. Doctors Pons and Fleischmann at the University of Utah announced that they had a little cell which was using a special form of water that's in all water. It's in fact called heavy water. 1 out of every 6,500 water molecules is heavy. Okay, it has heavy hydrogen in it. And they said, look, we pass a current through this cell, and it has palladium electrodes and a palladium electrode and another electrode, pass electricity through it. They said we get much more heat out of this cell than can be accounted for by any known ordinary chemical reaction. It must be nuclear, and we believe it may be fusion, akin to what is going on inside the stars, but not with lethal radiation.
Okay. Let's start out with some of the basics, and they are very elementary if you have a science background. Okay, first you have the atom.
Yes.
Okay, the atoms make up molecules. Yeah. Molecules make up matter. All right, so far?
Molecules are matter,
okay.
Atoms are matter, yes.
All right. Now, the atom is made up of electrons with neutrons and protons in the nucleus.
Right. The nucleus is very tiny. If the nucleus of an atom, any atom you want to pick, is the size of a pea, then the outside of the atom, the electrons flitting about, very light particles, would be the size of a football stadium. So we're mostly all space, and our nuclei are very tiny within each atom. If you could blow up an atom to the size of a football stadium, that's the scale it would be.
Okay. One other minor point, not minor, but one other basic point. Chemistry involves the manipulation of the electrons.
Yes.
Nuclear physics involves the manipulation of the neutrons and protons.
In the nucleus.
In the nucleus.
That's correct.
Those two sciences don't overlap.
That's right.
Is that right?
In other words, when you do ordinary chemical reactions like burn a match or light a cigarette or burn oil in your oil burner or coal in a fuel plant, you are doing chemical reactions. All the atoms, as far as science knew up to Pons and Fleischmann's time, all the atoms never change. The only way you can change the identity of an atom, for example, hydrogen into helium, like the sun does, is to have very, very high temperatures, hundreds of millions of degrees, 20 million degrees, what have you, or in large, fantastic accelerators that cost billions of dollars. The idea that at ordinary temperatures, or even hundreds of degrees or 1,000 degrees, any atom should ever change is unthinkable by modern physics.
Okay. You have fusion, which is you take two hydrogen atoms, fuse them into helium, releasing energy. I'm just going to go through two more basic points here. That is the differentiation between cold fusion and hot fusion. Cold fusion uses chemistry to fuse the nucleus at room temperature.
Okay, let's start with some basic ideas here. Ordinary hot fusion, like the sun does, or like what the people at Princeton University in their tokamak reactor do, they create hundreds of millions of degrees, or in the case of the sun, only 20 million degrees.
They use
in the core.
lasers, right?
Sometimes they use lasers, but at Princeton they use high magnetic fields and electric currents and so forth to squeeze the atoms into a frenzy so that the positive charges of the nuclei don't have as much effect anymore, and basically you get close enough, the positive charges of different atoms, like hydrogens, get close enough and they can fuse and create a new element, like helium. That's hot fusion.
Okay.
Now, cold fusion is just a name, and it was given as a complicated historical fact as to how that arose. But it does come certainly because Pons and Fleischmann in 1989 were telling the world that they could do the equivalent of making energy without dangerous radiation. They could change elements, because they thought they had evidence of that, in a little cell, in a cell like this, a cold fusion cell, this experimental one, for example. They said they could do it. This was very radical, still is, by those who aren't looking at the evidence. But the bottom line from Pons and Fleischmann was this: out comes heat, which we want, and energy for use, and generating electricity and hot water and so forth, not deadly radiation. Moreover, much more energy coming out than any chemical reaction could possibly explain.
Okay, so they cause the nucleus to fuse at room temperature.
They cause some change in the nuclei.
All right.
Those changes are very complicated, still controversial, even within the cold fusion research community.
All right, let's look at some of the problems with cold fusion.
Yes.
I guess you could start out, one of the problems, as I understand it, is that in order to prove something scientifically, you have to do it over and over again in order to get the same results. And this has not been true with cold fusion experiments?
That was true in the beginning. There were difficulties. In fact, Pons and Fleischmann happened to pick, since they were brilliant scientists, they happened to pick the most difficult of the cold fusion systems now. This is heavy water. That's what they started with. And they had a palladium electrode, a special metal. When they packed the deuterons, the nuclei of this heavy hydrogen, into the palladium, they got this excess heat, and others also got the excess heat. But it wouldn't come always on a regular basis. It would be sporadic. We now know that it's a very severe problem of this system having to do with the nature of the palladium. The scientists who did what I would call a hit-and-run job on cold fusion in 1989, they looked at the sporadic evidence, they looked at the difficulties at the time, and because many of them in this federal panel that looked at it had definitely a preconceived notion, their admission now is they had a preconceived notion, so of course they came to reject it very quickly. But the evidence now, I must tell you, is beyond doubt. Not only is it beyond doubt, and in many instances fully reproducible in systems, particularly those that use ordinary water. There are now systems that use nickel electrodes, not palladium, and every single time you get excess heat of a massive nature.
What then is with Japan and them closing their
new hydrogen energy program.
Their research of cold fusion,
Yes.
MITI?
The Japanese Ministry of International Ministry of Trade and Industry set up a very highfalutin program.
And they recently closed it.
And they recently said they were going to close it down. It's still doing the research there. They had what we call a lot of bricks and mortar, much as the hot fusion people have. Huge buildings, huge devices, huge bureaucratic programs. In this case, they bought lots of equipment. They started reinventing the wheel, as Japan often does. We, in our magazine, Infinite Energy, warned about 5 or 6 months ago that the incompetence level of certain scientists dragged in at the last minute who were working there was very, very bad. So, yes, Japan has formally closed its program, but that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not cold fusion is real. Just as any given, say, competitor in the car industry or the aircraft industry may have problems with the particular technology they're pursuing. Of course, yes, they had problems.
Okay, was this discovery in '89 oversold initially? Is that what some of the problem may have been?
Yes.
Now, these two professors, as I understand it, have been kind of outcast in the scientific community?
Well, absolutely. Nature magazine and Science magazine, which are the two official organs of science press, and they influence general news media such as the New York Times and so forth, these magazines refuse to put anything positive about cold fusion in. In fact, cold fusion scientists don't even waste their time any longer. They publish elsewhere, in Physics Letters A, in the Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences of Japan, Fusion Technology, which is a publication of the American Nuclear Society that deals, ironically, with both hot fusion and cold fusion. That's where you'll find cold fusion papers, and in our magazine, Infinite Energy. They don't even waste their time with nature or science. So yes, they're totally outcast from that bailiwick. The American Physical Society, as an example, went on the warpath against cold fusion prematurely for no good reason, just what I would call bigotry. Now, of course, there will be, when cold fusion is commercialized, and that's where
what
we're
you're
at now.
working on.
We're not only our group, but hundreds and hundreds of scientists around the world are working on commercial products. And there are commercial products now, mainly in small U.S. private corporations. Certain larger ones like Motorola are very interested in this and are following it. This is serious business. It doesn't matter, and this is historically the case, it doesn't matter what the establishment believes. Whatever nature is really telling us, that's truth.
Take you back to when you were working at MIT.
Yes.
What happened to you at MIT? From my readings, it almost sounded something like a movie. You know, you
It is.
kind of came in at the last
Right.
minute and crashed the meeting.
Well, it wasn't the last minute. Well, I'll tell you the basic story of what happened at MIT. It's rather astonishing. I was very friendly with all the hot fusion boys over there. In fact, I was always a fan of hot fusion. I'm an engineer. I thought hot fusion is a great idea. The idea that we could get infinite energy out of the ocean waters using the heavy water in the ocean. And well, as the cold fusion story broke, and I was the chief science writer at the MIT News Office, it was my job to handle both the cold fusion claims, the proponents. There were some proponents at MIT and still are, Professor Hagelstein, for example, and the hot fusion people who were making fun of it. Now, I didn't know what was right. I was an engineer and scientist enough to follow the evidence, and I saw the evidence going upward. It was getting better and better and better and better, and it became eventually overwhelming 2 years after the announcement. It was overwhelming. That's what I said in Fire from Ice. But I saw the hot fusion people doing all sorts of dirty tricks, unbelievable dirty tricks behind closed doors. For example, planting press stories in the newspaper in the earliest of days, late April 1989, hardly a month after Pons and Fleischmann announced. They were already calling Pons and Fleischmann frauds. They did call them frauds in the newspaper. And they then said that they didn't call them frauds because they were afraid of being sued and so forth and so on. Then they planted stories of the fact that the whole thing was a joke and it should be just erased.
Now, you were a science writer in
I was
the
a
public
science writer
relations department.
In the news office of MIT,
Okay.
which is the central news distribution for the popular press and for the MIT community in Tech Talk, the newspaper, the 20,000 circulation school newspaper. I was very happy and proud to be there at my alma mater. But when I saw what they were doing, I could not believe it. Not everything came out in my book. I made the book Fire from Ice does indeed tell the story of the first 2 years of cold fusion. But I only learned of some even nastier tricks later on. You know, the MIT people claim that there was no evidence for cold fusion. They did it on the basis of nuclear evidence. They said, well, we don't see neutrons of the appropriate magnitude, which was setting a straw man up to begin with. It says, it doesn't work like hot fusion, therefore it can't be real. You should be dead. Pons and Fleischmann, all other cold fusion people working on this, you should be dead. Since you're not dead and killed by the radiation corresponding to the heat that you claim to be generating, you are frauds. You are incompetent. That was the basic storyline launched at MIT. And MIT was the leader, the MIT hot fusion people, with their Princeton, New Jersey allies, were the key culprits.
You're not going to get me in trouble, are you?
No, of course not. The worst culprit was the U.S. Department of Energy, which hired a man, Dr. John Huizenga, who in his book, and anyone can look at his book if they want to, Cold Fusion, the Scientific Fiasco of the Century, in which he proudly admits, I knew it was nonsense in the beginning, and I told them, don't even have a panel. Don't have a panel. It's completely preposterous. Let's get rid of it. Don't even think of it. But they hired him anyway. Professor Happer, now at Princeton, also on that panel, said just by looking at Pons and Fleischmann on television, you could tell they were incompetent boobs. That's the attitude with which he went into there. So if you have a panel like the O.J. Simpson trial or this recent trial in Cambridge, Massachusetts involving a young lady, and you have jurors that are so outrageously biased, what do you think you're going to get? You're going to get that answer.
Okay.
The negative answer.
All right. Let's look at the implications of both hot and cold fusion.
Absolutely.
The way I understand it, the public wins.
They would win either way.
In either case.
If either worked, they would win.
Unlimited energy using water as fuel.
Absolutely.
No pollution, extremely cheap. Is that the bottom line?
That's the bottom line for cold fusion. For hot fusion, it is true that in principle it can be done. They haven't done it. In other words, they've never gotten more energy out than in. And moreover, it will always be, according to all projections, even by the most optimistic hot fusion people, it will always be a very large machine. You're not going to put a hot fusion reactor in your basement.
Okay.
And you're going to have power lines going all over. And Professor Litsky at MIT, who left hot fusion years ago in disgust, said, yes, you can eventually make it work, but no one is going to buy it. And the proof of that is that there is no private money in hot fusion. Zero.
The proponents of hot fusion, you could safely say, would be threatened if
Absolutely.
cold fusion, because nuclear physicists would be replaced by chemists.
In effect, yes. You see, the hot fusion program gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They used to get about 350 million magnetic fusion, or mag fusion as they call it. And now they're down to about 240 million. So they're getting angrier and angrier and leaner and meaner. And they basically didn't like in 1989 the very threat that even if congressmen believed it might be true, they might divert $25 million from their monolithic program and just check out cold fusion. They didn't want that.
So
they'd be out of business if when the world realizes that there are commercial products based on this coming out in the next few years. That will be the end of the hot fusion program.
It would be safe to say then that conventional energy conglomerates would be threatened if either cold or hot fusion. But let's talk about research money, because it's, in your view, a lot of money would be needed to research cold fusion. And why don't you think this money is being given to universities to research cold fusion?
Well, because the government panel, within 3 months, came up with this preposterous rush to judgment, which, of course, because Huizenga and Happer and company believed it was nonsense to begin with, they came out with the expected answer. And they haven't even stepped back since then to look at the data, all right? That's why the government is not giving any money for this. Although bootlegged research has occurred, and by the way, federal research by Drs. Clater and Storms and Dr. Melvin Miles at the Navy Research Lab in China have confirmed this phenomena beyond any question, and it's published in federal reports. Bootlegged or research money set aside by the director on the sly of Los Alamos, which has confirmed this in spades, just as it has been confirmed in spades
So now
in Japan.
you're just saying on my show
Right.
that the government is on the sly giving money
Yeah,
to...
oh, no, not in a coherent way. Not in a coherent way. In other words, the monolithic Department of Energy gives out no central money for cold fusion.
Okay.
But occasionally what happens, bootlegging occurs, occurs,
Okay.
or the director allows it to happen.
Okay, I can see I'm going to get in trouble here.
That's not trouble.
Okay. Tell us about this.
Well, this is just an example of a cold fusion cell. Actually, this one, Evan Ragland of Diamond Head, Mississippi, he happens to be the inventor of the daisy wheel printer. He came up with this idea. It's a slight variant of the Pons-Fleischmann cell. It has a piece of palladium in it, and it has the same kind of platinum anodes material, but it has two, and they flip back and forth with the voltage between two sides of this palladium plate. Of course, what you do is you have heavy water in there, you have electricity going in, and it's still DC current. Most engineers know what that means, just direct current, but it flips back and forth between two cathodes, two anodes. And what you finally find from this is more heat out than in when it works. This one hasn't shown very much excess heat. We tested it ourselves. This particular variant in our laboratory in Bow, New Hampshire, we were not able to find excess heat. We've tested it in England too, and others have tested it. But just to show you how the original Pons-Fleischmann system was very difficult indeed. However, I have to tell you that right now, in laboratories such as Blacklight Power Corporation in Malvern, Pennsylvania, Clean Energy Technologies of Sarasota, Florida, Eneco in Salt Lake City, they have prototype units which are putting out hundreds of watts of power. This is clean power, no radiation, still mysterious. We don't fully understand it, but there is, as an engineer and a scientist, there, from the bottom of my heart and my understanding of how this elementary science can work, you can determine it as an engineer without knowing how it's working on the micro scale of physics. It's positive.
In an ideal world, what would you like to see happen? Just
Well,
tons of money thrown at this?
No,
What?
I want not one red cent from the Department of Energy. In fact, if I were the President of the United States, I would rather like to see the Department of Energy disappear, because the Department of Energy has two main problems: energy for the people of the United States and cleaning up the horrible nuclear waste that we have. Now, guess what? Cold fusion will absolutely solve this problem once it's commercialized, and we don't need Uncle Sam's billions of dollars to do it. Private companies are doing it.
A commercial venture is the only way at this point. Is that what you're working on?
One of the many things I'm working on, I'm the editor-in-chief of Infinite Energy magazine. I do experiments, but I also help and consult with companies that are working in this. There is a venture fund that has been started already in this field, and it has already got investment money, and it is beginning to invest in the cold fusion companies.
I guess one of the things that usually happens is that the power companies themselves fund things that they think may be replacing them somewhere down the line, but they're not really doing that.
They did. In fact, if anyone checks out, you can look at our webpage, www.infinite-energy.com, and you'll have links to Blacklight Power Corporation, Clean Energy Technologies. Pacific Corp, an energy company, has already funded Blacklight Power, which is generating cold fusion energy, to the tune of millions of dollars.
Because when you think of it, look at everything that would be affected by this. You've got the international oil companies, the Middle East coal companies, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants. All of this would be...
That's correct. It will all be changed. Just as the computer revolution got rid of typewriters, just as the telephone got rid of most telegraphy, just as television, well, it doesn't completely suppress radio, but to a large extent, and just as a best analogy of all, air flight, which was deemed impossible by mainstream science, even after the Wright brothers flew. It took them 5 years to convince the New York Times and the Scientific American and so forth that they really had a flying machine, even though they were flying in broad daylight in Ohio. It's that intense a controversy.
What are your critics saying about you?
Well, one critic recently said, I'm proud of this, one of the big mouthpieces of the American Physical Society.
Since I don't have them on the show, maybe you could forego
we'll have
their
them on
name.
sometime.
Okay.
Mr. X of the American Physical Society said, Gene Mallove is okay, but in the mainstream, he's a joke. And I find that a rather wonderful compliment.
Are they just saying junk science? Is that what they're calling you?
Well, one very bad TV producer recently on national television happened to say that. He said the reason Pons and Fleischmann made their historic announcement in 1989 was that they wanted to be famous. What a ridiculous statement, even after they were given evidence to the contrary to show that, okay, even if you don't believe cold fusion, at least understand there are thousands of scientists working on this and companies working on it.
I'd like to also read a quote from you. A portion of the resources for research have to be set aside to support work in unpopular and even disturbing ideas if those ideas can hold the attention of reputable scientists over time. That's how progress in science is made.
Absolutely.
Is that pretty much sum it
up? What I do believe, and this is even a broader issue, Maria, than just the cold fusion story, far beyond. We are very familiar with the way that mainstream science very often ridicules things that we don't have final answers to. For example, there are many alternative health practices which many of your listeners may be familiar with. Now, I'm not validating any of them. All I'm saying is, clearly some of them, as an example, acupuncture, has risen to a level of empirical validation, even though we still don't understand what it is, that insurance companies are paying for it. There are many profound ideas in science left open that are being routinely ridiculed by what I perceive to be a very arrogant scientific establishment. I don't want to have anything to do with the government funding agencies that have the frontiers of science suppressed.
This shouldn't be a career ender, is what you're saying, for a scientist if he believes that he'd like to look into this, but it may be.
Julian Schwinger, Nobel laureate, who's no longer with us, he died, okay, but he was a very strong proponent of cold fusion, and he, even though he's a Nobel laureate, and he won the Nobel Prize with Richard Feynman in 1965, he was prohibited from publishing his theories in the American Physical Society journal, so he quit.
Okay. Excellent interview. Thank you for taking the time. I'd
You're
like
welcome.
to put up your address and phone number if people would like information on Infinite Energy Magazine. Please write to Post Office Box. First, let me give you the telephone number, 603-228-4516. That's 603-228-4516, or write to P.O. Box 2816, Concord, New Hampshire, 03302 2816. That's P.O. Box 2816, Concord, New Hampshire, 03302 2816. And for more information about common concerns, write to P.O. Box 55597, Trenton, New Jersey, 08638. Thank you for watching Common Concerns, a show known by the company it keeps.